Picture this. New York City, October 1924. You are an institutional investor reviewing a pristine, beautifully bound prospectus on a mahogany desk in Lower Manhattan. The yield on domestic municipal bonds has been stagnating, but the document in front of you offers something unprecedented. A foreign sovereign bond paying a highly attractive 7% yield, backed by the industrial might of a recovering European nation and implicitly endorsed by the most prestigious financial institutions in the United States. Your broker tells you this is not merely a lucrative investment, it is a patriotic duty. You are helping to rebuild a shattered continent. You are funding the reconstruction of the German Republic. You sign the transfer, you secure the yield. You believe you have made a rational, mathematically sound decision based on the fundamentals of international finance. What you do not know, and what the impeccably dressed men who designed this bond will never admit in public, is that you have just become a critical gear in a machine that will inevitably dismantle global stability. You are not financing civilian reconstruction. You are providing the foundational capital for the most devastating military-industrial complex in human history. The conventional narrative of the Second World War assigns the blame to a sudden political rupture. The history books present a story of a fanatic who seized power, hypnotized a desperate nation, and dragged the world into darkness through pure ideological force. But when you bypass the political rhetoric and examine the forensic accounting, a completely different, far more mechanical reality emerges. Wars of global conquest require staggering amounts of capital. They require deep water ports, vast chemical processing facilities, synthetic fuel refineries, and mechanized supply chains. A nation that had been bankrupted, stripped of its territory, and humiliated by hyperinflation does not suddenly acquire these assets through political speeches. It acquires them through debt. And the men who underwrote that debt did not wear military uniforms. They wore tailored suits, operated out of Wall Street and Basel, and viewed international conflict not as a moral catastrophe, but as a highly structured financial opportunity. By the end of this analysis, you will understand the exact architecture of the hidden financial plumbing that made the Second World War possible. You will see the mechanisms used by global finance to fund both sides of the conflict, and you will realize that the structures built to execute this wealth transfer were never dismantled. To understand how American capital rebuilt the German war machine, we must first look at the mathematical trap set at the Palace of Versailles in 1919. The victorious Allied powers drafted a treaty that stripped Germany of roughly 13% of its territory and 12% of its population. More importantly, they confiscated 48% of its iron production capacity and a massive share of its coal resources. Then, having removed the nation's ability to generate industrial wealth, they handed Germany a bill for 132 billion gold marks. This was not an economic policy. It was a mathematical impossibility. The British Treasury representative, John Maynard Keynes, immediately recognized that attempting to extract this level of capital from a crippled economy would trigger catastrophic instability. A sovereign nation trapped under impossible debt obligations has very few mechanical options. When Germany defaulted on its resource deliveries in 1923 and French troops occupied the industrial Ruhr Valley, the German government resorted to the only tool it had left. It printed the currency into oblivion. By the end of 1923, the exchange rate reached 4.2 trillion marks to a single United States dollar. Savings evaporated, the middle class was completely annihilated. But this economic collapse threatened a much larger ecosystem. During the First World War, American financial institutions had loaned billions of dollars to the British and French governments to fund their military campaigns. London and Paris absolutely relied on the German reparation payments to service those massive debts back to Wall Street. If the German economy fractured completely, the reparations would stop. If the reparations stopped, the Allies would default. If the Allies defaulted, the apex financial institutions of the United States would face a systemic liquidity crisis. Wall Street did not intervene in Germany out of humanitarian concern. They intervened to save their own balance sheets. In 1924, an international committee chaired by American banker Charles Dawes engineered a massive financial restructuring. The Dawes Plan reorganized the German central bank under foreign supervision and, crucially, opened the American capital markets directly to German borrowing. An initial loan of 800 million marks was floated on the American market, managed by J.P. Morgan and eagerly consumed by American investors flush with capital. This initiated one of the most absurd and destructive circular flows of capital in modern history. American banks issued billions in long-term bonds and short-term loans to Germany. Germany took those American dollars and handed them to France and Britain as reparation payments. France and Britain then transferred those exact same dollars back to New York to pay down their war debts. It was a closed loop. American capital was effectively leaving the country, washing through Europe, and returning to the exact same American banks, generating lucrative underwriting fees and interest payments at every stop along the route. By the end of the 1920s, foreign loans totaling approximately 29 billion marks had flowed into the German economy, with American bankers providing roughly 70% of that capital. But this is the critical juncture where the financial maneuver became a geopolitical weapon. A vast portion of this capital did not flow into civilian infrastructure. It was aggressively channeled into massive industrial syndicates. The loans modernized German steel plants, expanded deep-water shipyards, and financed sprawling chemical conglomerates. The Dawes Plan was functionally pre-financing the reconstruction of the German military-industrial base. Consider the partnership forged in the late 1920s between Standard Oil of New Jersey, the most powerful energy company in America, and IG Farben, the undisputed titan of German chemical manufacturing. Modern mechanized warfare faces a strict physical limitation. A nation without natural rubber and domestic crude oil cannot sustain an armored invasion or keep an air force in the sky. Germany had neither. Through a series of highly sophisticated cartel agreements, Standard Oil shared its critical patents for synthetic rubber and the hydrogenation process required to convert coal into synthetic aviation fuel. The chemical giant IG Farben, which would later manufacture the Zyklon B gas used in the extermination camps, relied completely on this American intellectual and financial capital. Internal memorandums captured after the war explicitly stated that without the technical knowledge and financial backing of Standard Oil, critical components of the German war production simply could not have been executed. Wall Street was not merely funding an abstract economic recovery, they were actively transferring the specific technological capabilities required for continental warfare. This debt-fueled industrial expansion created the illusion of a golden era in Germany. Unemployment fell and factories hummed, but the entire architecture was inherently fragile. Germany was not producing surplus wealth to pay its obligations, it was servicing old debt by taking on new, higher-yielding foreign debt. When the American stock market collapsed in October 1929, the global credit window slammed shut. The banks in New York, suddenly facing their own catastrophic liquidity crisis, immediately recalled their short-term foreign loans. The river of American capital that had been artificially sustaining the German state evaporated overnight. The consequences were mathematically brutal. Between 1929 and 1932, German industrial production plummeted. Unemployment skyrocketed from just over 1 million to more than 6 million. A third of the working population was left without an income. It is here that the forensic data reveals the precise mechanism of political radicalization. Academic research on this specific period demonstrates that political extremism did not rise in a vacuum. It rose in direct, quantifiable proportion to financial instability. When the major German banks collapsed in 1931, the resulting destruction of wealth and freezing of credit operated as a massive psychological trauma. Data models confirm that exposure to failing financial institutions directly increased the probability of extremist voting. For every standard deviation decline in local income caused by the banking collapse, support for the Nazi Party surged by over 4%. The financial elite had built a system entirely dependent on continuous credit expansion. When they pulled the liquidity, they intentionally triggered a sovereign depression. The ensuing despair and hunger did not happen by accident. It was the logical consequence of a sudden deleveraging. The populace, watching their democratic institutions fail to protect them from international capital flows, abandoned moderation. they turned to a fringe extremist movement that promised absolute order, the repudiation of foreign debt, and the violent restoration of national sovereignty. When the new regime consolidated control in 1933, they did not have to build a military-industrial base from scratch. The American investment banking syndicates had already built it for them. The political leadership changed, but the corporate partnerships remained completely intact. By the time the German military machine rolled into Poland in September 1939, triggering the Second World War, the operational integration between American capital and German rearmament was staggering. The German subsidiary of the Ford Motor Company, operating in Cologne, aggressively retooled to produce heavy transport vehicles for the military. By 1942, roughly one-third of the 350,000 trucks utilized by the German army were produced by Ford factories operating inside the Reich. General Motors, through its Opel division, dominated the remaining market share, manufacturing the armored vehicles and propulsion systems that drove the invasion of Europe. The logistical nightmare of tracking, transporting, and organizing millions of people for forced labor and systematic extermination was solved using American data processing technology. The German subsidiary of IBM provided the Hollerith punch card systems used to conduct the precise census operations that identified targeted minority populations. These machines were installed directly within the infrastructure of the concentration camps, managed by technicians trained by the parent corporation to catalog the movement of prisoners and the grim logistics of mass murder. And while these corporations manufactured the physical machinery of the war, the apex financial institutions maintained the flow of capital. In Basel, Switzerland, operating behind the veil of strict neutrality, sat the Bank for International Settlements, or the BIS. Founded in 1930 with the assistance of J.P. Morgan executives, the official purpose of the BIS was to facilitate the transfer of German reparations. Its true function was to serve as an untouchable clearinghouse for the global central banking network, operating entirely beyond the jurisdiction of any national government. During the deadliest conflict in human history, while American and British soldiers were dying on multiple fronts, the BIS kept its doors open. Its board of directors included senior Nazi officials, alongside Allied central bankers. The president of the institution, Thomas McKittrick, was an American who traveled freely through Nazi-occupied territory, conducting cordial meetings with the German Central Bank in Berlin. The neutrality of this institution was a legal fiction designed to protect wealth. During the war, the BIS actively processed tons of gold looted from the central banks of invaded nations. When the German military occupied Czechoslovakia and stripped its national gold reserves, the transfers were facilitated through the accounts of the BIS. The institution functioned as an indispensable financial artery for the Axis powers, laundering stolen sovereign wealth into the hard currency required to purchase raw materials from neutral countries. The collaboration was not limited to neutral Switzerland. Inside occupied France, operating under the direct control of the collaborationist Vichy government, the Paris branch of Chase National Bank simply refused to close. While other American businesses fled the continent, Chase continued to operate. They serviced the accounts of the occupying German forces. Following the decrees of the Nazi regime, the bank systematically froze the accounts of Jewish customers, executing the financial confiscation with what its own branch director described in internal memos as a spirit of enthusiastic cooperation. Business expanded, deposits grew. The bank generated immense profit from the occupation, treating the violent subjugation of a republic as an expanding emerging market. Similarly, the Wall Street investment bank Brown Brothers Harriman, through its affiliated Union Banking Corporation in New York, functioned as a critical financial conduit for Fritz Thyssen, the German steel magnate who heavily financed the early Nazi Party. A managing director of this operation, Prescott Bush, oversaw the transfer of funds, gold, and raw materials between the United States and the German industrial syndicates that were producing explosives and armor plating for the enemy. It was not until late 1942, nearly a year after the United States had formally entered the war, that the government finally seized the assets of the Union Banking Corporation under the Trading with the Enemy Act. This is the forensic reality of international finance, It operates on a plane entirely removed from national loyalty or human suffering. The men who approved the loans, who transferred the patents, who managed the looted gold, and who froze the targeted accounts were not ideologically committed to fascism. They were not political fanatics. They were highly educated, perfectly rational institutional managers. They operated under a specific psychological framework, the absolute belief that capital is neutral. They convinced themselves that their only moral obligation was to the health of the financial system, the preservation of liquidity, and the generation of yield. To a Wall Street banker in 1925, rebuilding German steel was a cash flow positive investment. To an American executive in 1940, selling synthetic fuel technology to a foreign military was the optimization of a patent portfolio. To a central banker in 1943, laundering looted gold was simply the maintenance of international clearing mechanisms. They stripped the humanity away from the data, viewing the political violence outside their windows as a regrettable externality that had nothing to do with the balance sheet. When the war finally ended, the European continent was a graveyard. Tens of millions were dead. The geopolitical map was permanently fractured. But the financial architecture emerged completely unscathed. The Roosevelt administration was fully aware of the corporate complicity, but made a deliberate, calculated decision to suppress prosecutions. The government concluded that prosecuting the largest industrial and financial conglomerates in America for wartime collaboration would destabilize the post-war economy. The corporate infrastructure was deemed simply too massive, too essential to the functioning of the state to be held accountable for its actions. Standard Oil paid a microscopic fine. The executives at Chase Manhattan moved on to highly distinguished, lucrative careers. Thomas McKittrick stepped down from the BIS, received a royal decoration from the Belgian government, and immediately became a vice president at Chase National Bank in New York. Prescott Bush faced no lasting public scandal and was eventually elected to the United States Senate. The Bank for International Settlements was never liquidated. It remains operational today, headquartered in Basel, managing the wealth of the global central banking elite, entirely immune from taxation or democratic oversight. The machine was never broken. It was simply recalibrated for the next cycle. History does not study these events to litigate the past. We study them to map the present. The fundamental rule of the international debt markets has not changed since the Dawes Plan of 1924. When sovereign debt expands beyond mathematical reality, the resulting collapse always manifests as political crisis. Today, we are witnessing the exact same structural forces accelerating on a global scale. Sovereign debt has reached levels that eclipse the burdens of the 1920s. Institutional capital is aggressively flowing across borders, searching for yield in jurisdictions regardless of their political stability or human rights records. Corporations operate as stateless entities, transferring technology and infrastructure to competing powers based solely on quarterly revenue projections. The financial elite still believe that capital is neutral. They still believe they can finance the adversaries of the future without suffering the consequences. And they still operate under the delusion that they can control the political forces their money unleashes. Do not look at the political theater to understand where the world is heading. Follow the debt. Track the flow of institutional capital. Watch where the heavy infrastructure is being built and who is underwriting the bonds. The financial architecture of the next systemic crisis is already fully constructed. The capital has been deployed. The only unknown variable is the catalyst that will force the ledger to balance. If this forensic examination of the past has altered your perspective on how global power actually functions, internalize these lessons. The patterns are mathematical. They repeat because human nature and the mechanics of compound interest do not change. Understand the true history of the systems that govern your wealth. Position your assets away from the centers of extreme leverage. Prepare your portfolio for the inevitable consequences of unpayable sovereign debt. The institutions will always protect themselves. It is your responsibility to protect your own.